One of my favorite film lines of all time has to be a line from Al Pacino in the film Devil's Advocate. I don't want to spoil that film because it's quite good for what it is. But essentially, Al Pacino, or the character he's playing, says this, and it's almost a direct quote: "The worst vice is advice." And you might not think that's anything special, but that, in fact, is a credo that I have stuck to for most of my adult life. And what I want to do today is talk about some of the problems we routinely encounter with the limited scope we have as individuals and limited experience, and extrapolate from that onto a more macro scale. So what exactly is he saying when he says the worst vice is advice? The problem with advice is that it's always predicated on somebody knowing something perhaps better than you or more about something than you do. And that individual, the individual giving the advice, that person's personal experience is somehow applicable to your life in most details, if not in every detail. And there's some variation there. But that's the problem with advice. That's the problem with the limited scope of personal individual experience. Because human lives are oftentimes vastly different at the level of individuals. The environments we grow up in, the cultures, our genomes, all of these things play into this to make it very, very difficult indeed to, quote unquote, give advice to somebody. In fact, these days I'm not even sure what that's supposed to mean. Now, of course, there are different types of advice. Some people might want really concrete advice about something very specific, and this very specific thing, one could argue, is such that whatever advice you give would likely be constant or applicable across the board in a general sense, maybe relating to some specific job or set of tasks at a job, and that job is still current and modern, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, fair enough. But generally speaking, that's not really advice, is it? Those are tips or pointers or somebody explaining something to you. Advice carries with it the connotation of advising somebody to do something. And more often than not, advising somebody carries with it implications that can affect a person's life. This is where it gets really difficult. How am I, and I could be anybody, I'm using myself as an example, in a position to give somebody good advice about his life trajectory when so many factors are different? Age differences, geographical differences, environmental differences, cultural differences, genetic differences. This is the problem. But we do live in a time, I would argue, where all too frequently people are more than willing to give advice. In fact, they love giving advice. So what do you think's up with that? Well, I can tell you what's up with that. We live in a time amplified by social media, etc., of unprecedented ego. And everybody is looking for self-affirmation. Everybody is looking to be proven right. And if not proven right, then made to feel good about themselves in some capacity. And if somebody is willing to give advice and you're willing to listen, well, you're boosting their ego, aren't you? And this can apply to anything. Take weightlifting routines, just as an example. There's some people out there that will swear by some variant of 5x5, irrespective of genetic differences, age, etc., and say that's the only way you're supposed to train. Still, other people will claim a bro split is the best way to go about it. Everybody has his idea about what an optimal training entails, and most people are more than happy to tell you that you're doing it wrong because you're not doing, 5x5 or the right bro split, or you're doing the wrong exercises or whatever. Take your pick. And where does this all come from? This comes from the idea that some people have trained on a certain routine at the gym and have been moderately to very successful on a certain routine, and I'm happy for them. That works for them, and it works quite well, and they think that they can extrapolate from themselves and that this personal experience signifies a universal in, say, resistance training. Therefore, everybody must do a 5x5 or a bro split or HST. But you know from personal experience at the gym, presumably if you hit the gym on occasion, that the gym going experience is one of trial and error, and it takes years and years to figure out what works for you. And what works for somebody else might not work for you. So somebody can be free to give advice. Say, hey, bro, man, you gotta do my bro split, man. Like Monday chest, Wednesday back, and Friday legs, and Sunday arms, and rinse and repeat, bruh. Okay, maybe for that guy that works. And somebody else says, no, 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 no. Only focus on compound movements. Only do 5x5. Here's how it's done. Okay? And you're sitting there confused. And maybe in your life you tried every routine they've mentioned and listed, and you're bewildered because you realize that it never really worked too well for you, and you're still experimenting. And that's perfectly fine. But what these people are doing, it's not unique to weightlifting, I'm using it as one example, is extrapolating their own personal experience of success in many cases and saying, if you do it my way, you will be successful just as I am. And the same applies to just everything under the sun. Think about the obsession we have with nutrition and dieting these days. Some people are completely anti-carb. Some people are pro-carb. Some people are eating only meat. Some people say fasting is the way to go. Some people say intermittent fasting is the way to go. And guess what? All these things could work. But you never hear that from these people. One, because many of these people are selling a product, either themselves or a certain nutrition routine, and rest assured they have some plan for you that you can buy from them. But also because their egos invest in it. So I have, for myself, have tried many different nutritional routines, and the thing that generally works best for me is a balanced diet that includes carbs, etc., etc. I don't really exclude anything unless it's really pernicious, like tubs of ice cream, because when I fast or when I do keto, my sleep is even worse than it usually is. So why should I listen to the advice of somebody saying, you need to do keto, you need to do it this way, and you'll look a lot better and feel a lot better, when I, one, don't feel a lot better, and two, sleep even worse, which contributes to me feeling even worse overall. And this is what I mean. They're so invested in this idea, and then they tell you that you're doing it wrong. Well, if you go practically zero carb on a keto diet, you can't really be doing it wrong because you're going to be in ketosis regardless. Again, just an example. Because all of these egos are bound up in the advice they're giving you. And many of these people, of course, have marketing plans that they want to sell to you, nutrition plans, exercise routines. I bring these two examples up because they're very accessible to most people. But it could apply to anything, dating advice, career advice, etc., etc. The problem that we have as individuals is we have a limited scope and a limited experience. And I cannot, for the life of me, extrapolate from my own experience and then tell you what to do with your life. Because I'm not you. Shockingly, I'm not you. And you hear the irony in my voice, but it should be pretty obvious, shouldn't it? Everybody knows that they're not you, yet they assume that what works for them has to work for you too, which is utterly bizarre considering things. Sure, there are things that we all have in common. We all need to eat, breathe, defecate, and sleep. But it's always in the nitty-gritty details where differences between people come to the fore and tend to be the most impactful, I think. Now, we have this problem of self-extrapolation and egos giving advice to people, but there's also a problem on a macro scale regarding this. And we are living in a time of this problem, and that is the problem of time-honored wisdom that no longer seems applicable, or at least is not as applicable as it used to be in the current modern context. So, for example, there are professions that were really reliable and really trustworthy in terms of job security, but that's not the case anymore. In fact, many of them don't exist. So the idea of a secretary typing something out, that doesn't really exist anymore. Not really. You have an assistant perhaps, but it's not exactly the same thing. Or a blacksmith. I mean, think about it. If somebody told you 2,000 years ago that being a blacksmith would be a reliable profession for the foreseeable future. And if you were to train your son and your grandson and all the future descendants to be blacksmiths, they'd be pretty decently set up, all things considered. Because war was constant, although it wasn't just war, and there was always a need for hammered out metal goods. Now, these days, if you said you wanted to become a blacksmith, well, the job security there isn't necessarily the same thing, and it's much more of an oddity than it is anything else. And likewise with so many things, and herein lies the problem. In late 2019, where we are right now, or mid-late, the job market is such that we don't really have a good idea of what's going to be the future secure job, right? Some people can make predictions, some people seem sure of themselves, but 15 years from now, given the rapid advances of technology, we simply cannot make these types of predictions. Again, 2,000 years ago, somebody said, being a blacksmith is a reliable trade and reliable work. He'd be right for almost 2 millennia onwards, but that's not the case anymore. But this is where I think going your own way really comes into this. Now, I'm not somebody who thinks marriage itself is some evil thing. It's not for me. I would never get married. But for other people, maybe. But here's the problem. We have this so-called time-honored institution that is really wobbly and doesn't work particularly well anymore because of the exigencies of our environment and the pressures they put on it. And so if you're a man, all these issues surrounding marriage, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with them, in addition to the general instability and fractiousness of the institution these days, really would make you think about whether or not that's a good idea for you, the individual man. But we have this collective memory of this thing being good, and that's just what you do, and you're supposed to just follow the great wisdom of the days of yore and the advice of all your elders, etc., etc. But that's not the case anymore, because it's a much, much more difficult path to navigate than it used to be. It's a bit akin to job security. There isn't any security in marriage anymore. And so you'd have to think twice about entering in that type of arrangement. And this should be the takeaway from what I've been saying here. Many people, too many people, arrogate to themselves the right as well as the jurisdiction to tell you, the individual man, what to do with your life, how you should train, how you should eat, what job you should do, what games you should play, etc., etc. Now, when I talk about something I enjoy doing on this channel, whatever it might be, a set of games, a genre, take your pick, that's just me talking about what I like. It doesn't mean that you have to like it or you should do it. If I occasionally fast or intermittent fast, it doesn't mean you should do it either. If you want to, you can try. I don't know if it's going to be good for you. I really don't. But that's not the message we hear these days. These days, the Ethernet is filled with ego-laden bobbleheads who are telling you what to do left and right. And if you don't do it, they get angry. Why? Because you're rejecting their ego. You're telling them that they're not as smart and knowledgeable as they claim they are. But ultimately, that's what you're going to have to do. Life from cradle to grave is about experimentation, learning things, stumbling, falling, and getting back up. How else are you going to get through life? Are you going to follow somebody's advice? Follow your little Excel tabulation to a T? That's not how life works. And this notion that what's good for me must be good for thee is an absolute fallacy when you take the time to think about it. Again, think about this one simple statement. I'm not you. It's obvious. Yet, if it were truly as obvious as it sounds to be, and I think it sounds obvious, not many people will be doing the things they're doing, or saying the things they're saying, or telling you what to do, and giving you their piss-poor advice of how you're supposed to live your life. Anyway, some thoughts on one of the more negative trends of our time, the ego-laden bobblehead who is a dispensary of the worst vice out there, namely advice. And gentlemen, if I'm still alive, and hail, I will see you all later. Until then, may the gods watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.